All right, y'all, we're going to get started. So if y'all want to kind of come gather up close, we'll get going here. If you're still eating, enjoy your food, and then you can squeeze up here in a bit. I do think it's good that we are now journeying through the book of Genesis in light of what's happening in our world today, because there's such a need to pray for peace and healing. And when you read the book of Genesis, you also see that the kind of the horrible things that are happening in our world today that were happening back at the beginnings. So, and God is continuously working to try to bring healing to humanity. All through the book of Genesis, you see that. And you also see the ripple effects of sin. So both are still very present on the world stage today. So I do think it's important for us to pray for peace in our world, and especially where there is conflict. And it's a place that is holy to the great religions of the West, to Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, that it would be the scene of such conflict and violence. It's the contrast, you know. So let's pray tonight for the peace of Jerusalem and indeed throughout the world. I encouraged you all to read at least as far as Genesis 25 to 36. If you're on your way toward the end of the book of Genesis, you're doing well. So the last couple of weeks before fall break, we were really looking at the beginning of what we call the ancestral narratives, beginning with Abraham and Sarah in chapter 12 in the book of Genesis, and how, as a result of human beings arriving at the Tower of Babel and disunity that afflicted all humankind, how God chose Abraham with the express purpose, we saw in chapter 11, of being a blessing to all the families of humanity. So that was God's method, as it were, to try to respond to the ripple effect of the curse of sin, to bring blessing back to humanity through the choosing of Abraham and Sarah. So the nature of these stories, when you read them, remember that those who study the book of Genesis with the historical lenses see narratives that have been handed down for 1,000 years plus before they were put into the final form of Genesis. So roughly Abraham and Sarah lived around 1800 BC, and the final form of the writings in the book of Genesis probably in the 6th century, 500s, during the Babylonian exile. So for over 1,300 years, those narratives are being handed down. And when you're reading the book of Genesis carefully, and I hope you were doing that, you notice that there do seem to be different styles of literature that get woven together, and sometimes the weaving is not as smooth in certain places. For example, if I ask you the question, why did Jacob go to Laban? What would your answer be? There's actually two different reasons in the book of Genesis. So it's a relative, so it's an uncle, the brother of Rebekah, but there's two different kind of origin stories for his departure to go there. And they're kind of side by side in Genesis. What he did to his brother. One is to get away from Esau before Esau killed him, right? So get out of Dodge before your brother kills you. That was one of the reasons given, right? That's probably the more ancient story, the Yahwist. The critical scholars look at that narrative, the style of writing, the vocabulary that's used, that sort of thing. So part of that, what we call the ancient Yahwist or the old epic narrative. So the second reason given is you got to go find a wife, right? So time to go find somebody among your own people. Esau had married two Canaanite women. So his parents didn't like that a whole lot. Why did you marry those two women? So it reminds us, by the way, doesn't it, of how polygamous the ancient beginnings were to Israel. So Esau has two wives, and if you read through the narratives that I'm suggesting, you see it gets a bit more complex with even Jacob, right? So these are our great ancestors in faith. These are stories that are handed down about the patriarchs and the fathers and mothers, the ancestral stories that have been shaped by long telling orally in Israel's history, woven together in a narrative, and eventually put into the final form that we have now in the book of Genesis. Probably the last hand who put the book together would be the priestly source who wrote the first chapter of Genesis, that beautiful creation narrative in 7 days, the idea of God's creating humanity in the image and likeness of God, and that blessing and that image being handed down all through the book of Genesis, that thread will continue. So that priestly author gets his final redaction or editing of the book of Genesis. And you even see that. But the interesting thing is this. The stories don't attempt to hide the messiness of the ancestors, do they? You probably picked that up if you read those chapters. So there's a lot of elements about the stories that you think, my, really, A part of that is in the 21st century, we experience a different set of cultural, social values, but also even to God's people, some of those stories would have been like, that's not good. You shouldn't be doing that. So they're wondrous stories, but again, underneath it all is God is speaking to us, communicating truth that is designed to lead us to salvation. So that's the divine work of God at work in the sacred text. So tonight we're going to zoom in on Isaac and Rebekah. We're going to look more carefully at their two sons, Jacob and Esau, or I should say Esau and Jacob. And we're going to look at, particularly, we're going to be focusing on the person of Jacob. So when you read the narratives, I did a study in literature when I was in Gonzaga University. And the literature professor said, if you look at the tone, how a character comes across in the text, would you describe Jacob in positive terms or negative terms? How did Jacob come across to you as you were reading the stories? Negative, I hear. Here's some negatives. Yeah. If you had to describe Jacob with adjectives, what adjectives would you select for Jacob? A scoundrel, deceitful, selfish. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah. He does not come across in the biblical text as a shining example of integrity. No, quite the opposite. He's sneaky, he's deceptive, he's, jealous. He steals his brother's birthright and his brother's blessing. So the character of Jacob is remarkably imperfect and remarkably human. So Jacob will become Israel, right? The father of the 12 tribes, or the 12 sons will be the 12 tribes of Israel.
But in reading this anew this time, his mom had quite a role in steering him.
His mother, Rebecca, sweet Rebecca. Yeah, what did you think about Rebecca?
She was paying attention and helping to guide.
She was paying attention and helping to guide the process. Yeah, she was kind of sneaky and deceptive too. Yeah, yeah. What about the character of Isaac? How did he come across to you all as you read the story? Yeah, he's kind of out of it, isn't he? He's kind of bumbling along. Yeah. Oh, did I give the blessing to the wrong son? How did that happen? I mentioned last time that Isaac, he almost got sacrificed by his father Abraham, and one biblical scholar said then he almost disappears from the text. You'll kind of get that feeling when you're reading the story that Isaac, he's not an actor. He did, he did give a blessing, and there's the birthright and all that, but it's really, he almost disappears from the text. You know, he's a transitional figure between Abraham and Jacob. So, yeah, Rebecca, on the other hand, is quite wily. What about Esau? What was your sense of Esau? How would you describe him with adjectives?
He was seeking immediate gratification of where he was at.
Yeah, immediate gratification. Yeah. He was kind of, you know, he wasn't responsible. He didn't act responsibly to ensure his reception of the birthright and blessing. He really kind of focused on short-term goals. So in that sense, you know, as deceptive and deceitful as Jacob was throughout the narrative, in a sense, he certainly was much more ambitious than Esau. And he said, I'm hungry, I just want some food, feed me, you know. How many of y'all felt that it was a bit unfair what Jacob and Rebekah did to Esau?
But I think that's what God intended to happen.
Okay, you think that's what God intended it to happen? You know, they say that God can write straight with crooked lines, right? It's interesting that God can take a deceptive, dishonest human being like Jacob and make him Israel, the father of his people. You know, there is something that we should think about with that.
With Jacob hanging on to Esau's heel when it came down
Yeah,
to the womb, maybe Jacob was supposed to be firstborn and it just didn't happen.
yeah, it's interesting. Now, remember too, the conflict between brothers. This is an ancient, you know, narrative in ancient literature. This conflict, sibling rivalry between Esau and Jacob. You see this over and over in human history, don't you? Some of you all may even have personal experiences in your own families of sibling rivalry, right? Of brothers and or sisters who don't get along with each other. And so the story about their birth, in a sense, is a way of already foreshadowing that conflict that's going to happen later. That Esau, though the firstborn, that already from the beginning, Jacob was grabbing at his heel, trying to pull him back in the womb, and he was trying to get ahead, even at birth. So yeah, it's a powerful narrative way of describing that conflict and the role that both Jacob and Esau play in that conflict. Did Isaac have a favorite son? Which one? Esau. Did Rebekah have a favorite son? Jacob, yeah. Yeah, it's not good when parents have favorites, right? It intensifies sibling rivalry, doesn't it? Yeah, it's interesting to watch the humanity playing out in the narrative. Yeah, profound descriptive narratives, I think. So, all right. Well, let's take a look at some of the texts. And yet, if you had to describe the theological depth underneath, the final hand is the priestly author. What's the bottom line theologically? God will choose Jacob as he chose Abraham. And he will choose to continue to be faithful to the covenant that he made with Abraham. Descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven, lands of the promised land, that will be given through Jacob and his descendants. So he will be the son of the promise, as Isaac was the son of the promise with Abraham. Esau will have his own family line, but the blessing that goes down from Abraham will go through Jacob. So, you know, God will choose somebody that we wouldn't pick as the hero and say, okay, you're going to be the guy. You're the one. So
Well, he married Jewish women too.
he did marry Jewish. How many Jewish women did he marry? Two, and he also had two concubines.
Canaanite women.
I know Esau, he married those foreigners. That was his problem, wasn't it? How about the nobility of Rachel? Isn't she wonderful? She stole her father's gods and put them on the cushion underneath her, right? I can't get up.
Anybody can understand why a mother would do that for one son and push another one away.
Yeah, why would a mother do that for one son? Favoritism, yes, John says.
Yeah, still.
Yeah, still, it's a troubling narrative to read, right? Oh, why would God choose such flawed people? That is the central theological point, isn't it? Yeah, that we are, that we are not much better than Jacob, really. We're flawed, wounded, broken human beings, and God will still choose us and choose to use us. And God, Jacob will suffer from consequences for his deceptiveness. And he will have to wrestle with God. There's going to be a purifying of Jacob as he goes through the process.
That go back to Sunday's gospel, the last shall be first and the first shall be last.
There's often in the scriptures that whole sense of reversal. You have those who seem to have everything, don't get it, and those who have nothing seem to get everything. Yeah, the logic of God is never quite what we expect.
And two, God knew Abraham was going to obey him and love him more than anybody else did. He probably knew Jacob would too.
In the end.
That's what God needed
Yep.
to represent himself.
And maybe God even is able to use Jacob's shrewdness to accomplish some things. Yeah, it is funny. And remember that Abraham set up the marriage with Isaac to make sure that Isaac would marry in the people, so not outsiders. So that's how Isaac and Rebekah met at the well. Abraham worked all that out before he died and was buried. So we saw that last time in chapter 24. So that continuity would continue. So let's go to chapter 25, and indeed, let's begin with the birth of Esau and Jacob. So we'll look at verse 19. This is the family history of Isaac, the son of Abraham, and Abraham had begotten Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padam Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramean. So that's Rebekah's brother, Laban, that Jacob will be going to see later. Isaac entreated the Lord on behalf of his wife since she was sterile. You notice the same theme that goes back to Sarah had been sterile, and Abraham and Sarah had waited a child. So again, another sterile mother of Israel. The Lord heard his entreaty, and Rebekah became pregnant, but the children in her womb jostled each other so much that she exclaimed, "If this is to be so, what good will it do me?" She went on to consult the Lord, and he answered her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two peoples are quarreling while still within you. But one shall surpass the other," that's Jacob, "and the older shall serve the younger." So it's a tough pregnancy. Those twins are already fighting with each other in the womb of Rebekah. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. The first to emerge was Reddish. The name Esau, by the way, Edom, the Edomites who are traced back to Esau, is kind of associated with the word for red in Hebrew. And also the word hairy gets connected. So reddish, hairy and reddish are the things. And the whole body was like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. His brother came out next, gripping Esau's heel, so they named him Jacob, somebody who grasps probably also has another meaning about God. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man who lived in the open, whereas so he was like his father or grandfather Abraham, right? So a herdsman. Whereas Jacob was a simple man who kept to his tents. Isaac preferred Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah preferred Jacob. So you see the parental preference already right at the outset. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the open, famished. He said to Jacob, "Let me gulp down some of that red stuff," another play on his name. "I'm starving." That is why he was called Edom. But Jacob replied, "First give me your birthright in exchange for it. So I want to be named firstborn in the family. Give me your birthright to eat this good stew." "Look," said Esau, "I'm on the point of dying. What good will any birthright do me?" So you see there Esau's disregard. I don't care about all that birthright stuff. By the Hebrew words birthright and blessing are very close to each other in Hebrew. So it's kind of a play on words. Esau doesn't care about his birthright, so he'll also lose the blessing later. But Jacob insisted, "Swear to me first." He is already cunning, isn't he? So he sold Jacob his birthright under oath. Jacob then gave him some bread and the lentil stew, and Esau ate, drank, got up, and went his way. Esau cared little for his birthright. So, yeah, if you read the text, Esau is, I don't need to worry about all that birthright stuff. All right, chapter 26 we've looked at before. This is the third version, 0.3.0 I said, of "my wife is really my sister," that Abraham used twice. Now Isaac will use it about Rebekah, so we're not going to go through that at this point. But let's go on down to chapter 27. Although I will note in verse 34 in chapter 26, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite. Hittites are enemies of Israel. And Basemath, daughter of Elon, the Hivite. They're also bad folks. So he's marrying those. He married outside our clan, Esau did. But they became a source of embitterment to Isaac and Rebekah, so both parents weren't happy with whom he married. Chapter 27, the whole story here is, and into 28, is kind of a masterpiece of narrative literature. So it's very suspenseful, sort of a little novelette. When Isaac was so old that his eyesight had failed him, he called his older son Esau and said to him, "Son." "Yes, father," he replied. Isaac then said, "As you can see, I am so old that I may now die at any time. Take your gear, therefore, your quiver and bow, and go out into the country to hunt some game for me. With your catch, prepare an appetizing dish for me, such as I like, and bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my special blessing before I die." Rebekah had been listening while Isaac was speaking to his son Esau. So when Esau went out into the country to hunt some game for his father, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, you notice his son, her So Jacob went and got them and brought them to his mother, and with them she prepared an appetizing dish, such as his father liked. Rebekah then took the best clothes of her older son Esau. Notice how she's getting the best clothing out of Esau's that she had in the house, and gave them to her younger son Jacob to wear. And with the skins of the kids she covered up his hands and the hairless parts of his neck. Then she handed her son Jacob the appetizing dish and the bread that she had prepared. Bringing them to his father, Jacob said, "Father." "Yes," replied Isaac. "Which of my sons are you?" Jacob answered his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I did as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your special blessing." But Isaac asked, "How did you succeed so quickly, son?" He answered, "The Lord your God let things turn out well with me." Isaac then said to Jacob, "Come closer, son, that I may feel you, to learn whether you really are my son Esau or not." So Jacob moved up closer to his father. When Isaac felt him, he said, "Although the voice is Jacob's, his hands are Esau's." He failed to identify him because his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So in the end, he gave him his blessing. Again he asked him, "Are you really my son Esau?" "Certainly," he replied. Then Isaac said, "Serve me your game, son, that I may eat of it and then give you my blessing." Jacob served it to him, and Isaac ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Finally his father Isaac said to him, "Come closer, son, and kiss me." As Jacob went up and kissed him, Isaac smelled the fragrance of his clothes. With that he blessed him, saying, "Ah, the fragrance of my son is like the fragrance of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give to you of the dew of the heavens and of the fertility of the earth abundance of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations pay you homage. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you." Jacob had scarcely left his father just after Isaac had finished blessing him when his brother Esau came back from his hunt. And he too prepared an appetizing dish with his game, and bringing it to his father, he said, "Please, father, eat some of your son's game, that you may then give me your special blessing." "Who are you?" his father Isaac asked him. "I am Esau," he replied, "your firstborn son." With that, Isaac was seized with a fit of uncontrollable trembling. "Who was it then," he asked, "that hunted game and brought it to me? I finished eating it just before you came, and I blessed him. Now he must remain blessed." On hearing his father's words, Esau burst out into loud, bitter sobbing. "Father, bless me too." He begged. When Isaac explained, "Your brother came here by a ruse and carried off your blessing," Esau exclaimed, "He has been well named Jacob," which means supplanter. "He has now supplanted me twice. First he took away my birthright, and now he has taken away my blessing." Then he pleaded, "Haven't you saved a blessing for me?" Isaac replied, "I have already appointed him your master, and I have assigned him to all the kinsmen as his slaves." So the heritage will go to Jacob already. That's the blessing. "Besides, I've enriched him with grain and wine. What then can I do for you, son?" But Esau urged his father, "Have you only that one blessing, father? Bless me too." Isaac, however, made no reply, and Esau wept aloud. Finally, Isaac spoke again and said, "Ah, far from the fertile earth shall be your dwelling, far from the dew of the heavens above. By your sword you shall live." It's going to have violence. "And your brother you shall serve. But when you become restive, you shall throw off his yoke from your neck." Esau bore Jacob a grudge because of the blessing his father had given him. And he said to himself, "When the time of mourning of my father comes, I will kill my brother Jacob. I'm going to kill that brother of mine who stole my blessing. When Rebekah got news of what her older brother Esau had in mind, she called her younger son Jacob and said, "Listen, your brother Esau intends to settle accounts with you by killing you. Therefore, son, do what I tell you. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran, and stay with him a while until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger against you subsides, and he forgets what you did to him. Then I will send for you and bring you back. Must I lose both of you in a single day?" Rebekah said to Isaac, "I'm disgusted with life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob also should marry a Hittite woman, this is a different source. A native of the land like these women, what good would life be to me?" Isaac therefore called Jacob, greeted him with a blessing, and charged him, "You shall not marry a Canaanite woman. Go now to Padan Aram, to the home of your mother's father Bethuel, and there choose a wife for yourself from among the daughters of your uncle Laban." So you got the two different reasons that Jacob has to leave his father and mother. So what did you think of the narrative of that story? It is dramatic, isn't it? It's kind of a tearjerker, isn't it? Kind of like, it's kind of the deceptiveness of Rebekah and Jacob, right? You know, and the begging, Esau begging his father, "Can't you bless me?" And his blessing wasn't like a very positive blessing, was it? No, but when you get restive, you're going to throw off his yoke. Yeah, very, very interesting. You know, so what happens to Jacob? Well, he did steal the blessing. He bought the birthright when Esau was hungry, and he knows Esau is going to kill him, so he gets out of Dodge. So he does go to the land of Laban. So, but you know, it's interesting because I mentioned earlier, Jacob will have consequences for his actions, right? One of the immediate consequences is he's not going to be able to come back home for a long, long time. How many years is he away? 20 years. He will be gone from Isaac and Rebekah and his brother Esau for 20 years. He'll be away from home. And part of that is sweet Uncle Laban, the brother of Rebekah, is also kind of deceptive and wily himself. So, you know, Jacob will have to suffer for he's got to suffer for what he's done for a long time. So, you know, so Jacob is crafty, he's deceptive, but his uncle is also crafty and deceptive. So he gets there and he falls in love with the younger son of Laban, Rachel. Leah, it says, is pretty, but Rachel's prettier, you know. So Leah's okay, but Rachel is really pretty. You know, that's kind of what the text implies. And so, you know, basically Jacob says to Laban, "You know, I want to marry Rachel. So what should I do?" "Well, why don't you serve me and be a shepherd for me for 7 years? And after 7 years, you know, you can marry Rachel after that point." So, but on the way to find himself a wife, and he, I will add, is successful in finding not just one wife, but 2 wives, and he also has children through a couple of their maidservants. So in the end, the 12 children come from 4 different women that Jacob has intercourse with, as the scriptures say. So, but on the way there, chapter 28, verse 10, this is a very important encounter. So far, since the pregnancy of Rebekah with Esau and Jacob, God's involvement is sort of minimal. but we're going to have an encounter here. Jacob departed from Beersheba and proceeded toward Haran. When he came upon a certain shrine as the sun had already set, he stopped there for the night. Taking one of the stones of the shrine, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep at the spot. Then he had a dream. A stairway reached on the ground with its top reaching to the heavens. And God's messengers, the word is angels of God, were going up and down the ladder. So you're imagining this is a connecting place on earth between earth and heaven, between God and Jacob. And the messengers, the angels of God, are traveling up and down this portal, this stairway. And there was the Lord beside him and saying, I, the Lord, am the God of your forefather Abraham, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you are lying I will give to you and your descendants. This is priestly hand at work. First chapter 1 of Genesis. These shall be as plentiful as the dust of the earth, and through them you shall spread out east and west, north and south. In you and your descendants all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. So the great blessing God gave Abraham in chapter 12 and chapter 28 now is being communicated through Isaac and through Jacob in this case. Know that I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go and bring you back to this land. I will never leave you until I have done what I have promised. This highlights something I said a couple of weeks ago, that the book of Genesis is about the promise of God, God's faithfulness, not our perfection as human beings. It's clear you have a rascal like Jacob. God is going to do his promise because of who God is, not because of who Jacob is. Right? The goodness of God, God's fidelity in his covenant. That's the highlight there. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he exclaimed, Truly the Lord is in this spot, although I did not know it. In solemn wonder he cried out, How awesome is the shrine! There is nothing else this is nothing else but an abode of God. And that is the gateway to heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head, set it up on a memorial stone, and poured oil on top of it. It's a sacred place. He called the site Bethel, which means the abode or house of God, where the former name of the town had been Luz. Jacob then made this vow, If God remains with me to protect me on this journey I am making, and to give me enough bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I come back safe to my father's house, the Lord shall be my God. This stone that I have set up as a memorial stone shall be God's abode. Of everything you give me, I will faithfully return a 10th part to you. So he's going to be a tither. The 10% God will go back to you. And that's when he's going to show up. And so this passage, by the way, is a very significant passage, not only for Jews, but also for Christians. Anybody know why for us that is significant? In the Gospel of John, Jesus references this episode and speaks about the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So what is John's Gospel telling us? Jesus himself is the true connection between earth and heaven. He is the stairway to heaven. So in John's Gospel, John will take all of the great traditions of the Jewish faith and show how Jesus fulfills, completes, and surpasses them. So Jesus is the true stairway to heaven, the true link between heaven and earth. So you'll see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. He said that to Nathanael. Remember, he told Nathanael, before I called you, you were sitting under that fig tree. And Nathanael said, you're the king of Israel. He gave a great affirmation of faith. And Jesus said, you said this because I told you, I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things. you'll see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So reference back to this text in John's Gospel. All right, so sneaky Jacob gets tricked by his uncle Laban. Let's see if I can find that little text. Yeah, so he agreed with Laban to serve him for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, whom he had fallen in love with. And if you go down to verse 21 in chapter 29, you see how Laban tricks Jacob. So then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may consummate my marriage with her, for my term is now completed. I've worked my 7 years for her." So Laban invited all the local inhabitants and gave a feast. At nightfall, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. Now, Jacob had fallen in love not with Leah, but Rachel. And Jacob consummated the marriage with her. This is the wedding night. Laban assigned his slave girl Zilpah to his daughter Leah as her maidservant. Why do you think the biblical text wants us to know who the maidservant is already? She's going to show up later in the story to have children with Jacob too. Yeah. In the morning, Jacob was amazed. It was Leah. Sort of odd, isn't it? Jacob didn't recognize that wedding night. That wasn't Rachel. It was Leah. He discovered it the next morning.
Very dark night.
It was a very dark night. Perhaps a little much of the fruit of the vine or something. What was going on there? Too much feasting. So he cried out to Laban, How could you do this to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why did you dupe me? Is it not the custom in our country," Laban replied, "to marry off a younger daughter before an older one? Finish the bridal week for this one, and then I'll give you the other one too in return for another 7 years of service with me." So yeah, you can have Rachel too, but you got 7 more years. You got 7 years of service for Leah. You're gonna have to do 7 more years for Rachel. So Jacob agreed. He finished the bridal week for Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel in marriage. Laban assigned his slave girl Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her maidservant. When you read on in the text, Rachel and Leah are going to do exactly what Sarah did. They're going to have their maidservants have intercourse with Jacob to have children. So, Jacob, Israel, becomes the father of 12 sons. Those are the beginnings of the 12 tribes of Israel. And those 12 sons come from 4 different women. So they come from Leah, Rachel, and the 2 maidservants. Jacob then consummated his marriage with Rachel also, and he loved her more than Leah. What does that sound like? It's planting a seed for a little jealousy. Remember Sarah and her maidservant? How that began to create some tensions in the household. That's going to happen here too. When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he made her fruitful while Rachel remained barren. So Rachel is now the 3rd woman in the line who can't have children. So Sarah couldn't, Rebecca couldn't, now the favored wife Rachel can't either at the beginning. Leah conceived and bore a son, and she named him Reuben. If I'm remembering correctly, Reuben isn't a stellar character either. What happens later in the story? I think Reuben sleeps with one of the maidservants later. Yeah. I think is it Reuben that saves Joseph or tries to? He did have the idea we shouldn't do this, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or no, maybe not kill him. Let's not kill him.
Yeah, let's not kill him. He did talk the brothers out of killing him. So it tells about the birth of the children. So chapters kind of 29 and 30, we're going into his marriages to Rachel, to Leah, and the origins of all the children. So through the various women in his life. And you even have that curious episode of the mandrakes. Did you notice that? Which were kind of considered erotic food and could produce the ability to have children and so forth. So the folk character of these narratives is pretty clear. Once he has served Laban for 14 years, he realizes that, he has his 2 wives, but all the flocks he's been taking care of for Laban are still Laban's flocks. So he can't leave now because he doesn't have anything. So he basically works out an arrangement with Laban. He says, what can I do to get some of the flocks? And so the agreement is 6 more years of service. So 7 years for each wife, 6 years for some flocks. So he's going to end up serving Laban for a generation, 20 years. But Jacob is cunning, more cunning than Laban. So did you read the narrative? What he does is he says to Laban, his uncle, okay, well, let's work out an agreement. So why don't I keep the animals that don't have spots and speckles? You keep the animals that have spots and speckles. And then Jacob, it's an old folk tale, but when they begin to have, the animals begin to breed, he puts them near these plants that cause more and more of them to become speckled and spotted so he can get more flocks. So in that way, he deceptively makes sure that he gets a really big herd and he's going to take the best and go off with it. So he's very cunning.
I have a question, because some of the 12 children came from concubines and from maidservants.
That's
Does
correct.
that not matter if they were not the natural wives in the history of the 12 tribes of Israel?
Well, isn't it kind of interesting that it shows sort of like, yeah, those tribes don't all come from Rachel and.
But who cares?
So yeah, let's take a quick peek at who comes from who. So from Leah, we get Reuben, right? Simeon, Levi, and Judah. So Judah becomes a key tribe. That's the tribe from which King David will come. So that's from the wife of Leah. Rachel is barren for a while, but eventually gives birth to Joseph, who is the linchpin of the narrative that follows this section. So Rachel's son Joseph has a pivotal role in the history of salvation. So, and Benjamin also comes from Rachel, the youngest son. So Joseph and Benjamin, and then Bilhah. They have Dan and Naphtali, right? And from Zilpah, the other maidservant, Gad and Asher. If I'm not mistaken, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, those may be the northern tribes of Israel. And then Issachar and Zebulun, those go back to Leah, right? And then also Dinah is born as a daughter, right? So we got the 12 sons and a daughter.
We have Judah too.
Yeah, Judah was son of Leah. Yep. So what happens? Laban kind of realizes Jacob is being deceptive, and he begins to go after Jacob. So Jacob has to flee from Laban. The Lord does intervene, basically, and if you look at chapter 31, on the 3rd day, always the 3rd day in the Bible is always symbolic. On the 3rd day, word came to Laban that Jacob had fled. Taking his kinsman with him, he pursued him for 7 days until he caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. But that night, God appeared to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream and warned him, take care not to threaten Jacob with any harm. So God is keeping the promise that he made when Jacob had the dream about the stairway, I will protect you. Laban, don't lay a hand on him. So divine intervention on that part. Now, what's funny is, as I mentioned earlier, and why did she do it? Who knows? Rachel stole the household gods of Laban. So she took his idols, and so here comes Laban chasing Jacob down, and he says, "Not only have you stolen my flocks, you also stole my gods, my household idols." And Jacob said, "I did not steal your idols. If anybody in this camp stole your idols, they should be put to death," basically. So he doesn't know that Rachel stole the idols. So he says, "Well, let me search then." So he searches all the tents. So sneaky Rachel, what does Rachel do? She's as sneaky as Jacob. She hides the idols in a camel's pillow, and she sits on it. And when he comes in to search her tent, she says, "Well, I'm having my womanly period. I really can't get up right now." So he leaves her be, and so he can't find the idols. So then Jacob gets in this huff and says, "Here you've accused us of stealing your idols, and none of it was true, and you go on back where you belong, and they make this pact that they will never pass this particular stone with hostile intent. You stay in your land, I'll stay in my land." So you've got a boundary between the two. So maybe we should put up some type of a stone in the Holy Land today. Don't go past, you may not pass this stone with hostile intent, Now, but there's still some unfinished business. What's the unfinished business here? Jacob and Esau, yes, the very reason Jacob left. 2 reasons. Got a wife. Well, he certainly accomplished that. 2 wives, 2 maidservants, and 12 children later, plus Dinah. He's on his way back to go see Esau and his mama and his daddy, see what's happened. And I will say this. He hears word that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. So that's not a very promising bit of news he gets. So what is he thinking? My brother Esau is going to kill me like he promised. Yeah, he's not forgotten about all that. So, Jacob, he is smart. I will say that for him. He's very, very smart. He decides to send waves of people ahead of him. He's a little self-centered in a way, because he organized maidservants kind of early in the line to meet Esau first, and Leah up front. Let's keep Rachel a little closer in to me, So he orders the family in a way to protect the ones dearest to him, But he sends these, I think it's 7 waves forward, and each one is to say to Esau, Esau, these are all gifts for you. Your brother is sending gifts ahead to you, So hopefully this is all going to work out. And this is where another pivotal narrative appears. So let's go to chapter 32 and verse 23, another famous narrative where God powerfully intervenes. In the course of that night, however, where is Jacob? Where is Jacob? He's been away for 20 years. He's heard Esau's coming with 400 men. He's terrified. He's scared. What's going to happen to me? So he's going to have a dream. In the course of that night, however, Jacob arose, took his 2 wives with the 2 maidservants and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had taken them across the stream and had brought over all of his possessions, Jacob was left there alone. So this is important. Everybody else is over on the other side. Jacob is alone. Then some man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Ever been in turmoil and couldn't sleep at night and feel like you were wrestling all night long, tossing and turning in the sheets? Something on your mind you cannot work out. Whew. When the man saw that he could not prevail over him, he struck Jacob's hip at the socket, so that the hip socket was wrenched as they wrestled. The man then said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." "What is your name?" Remember the importance of name. When You know the name, you can control the encounter. He answered, Jacob. Then the man said, You shall no longer be spoken of as Jacob, but as Israel. So God will now give Jacob a new name. Israel means to contend or struggle with. So he has struggled with God in the night. Because you have contended with divine and human beings and have prevailed. Jacob then asked him, Do tell me your name, please. And he answered, Why should you want to know my name? With that he bade him farewell. Jacob named the place Peniel, because I have seen God face to face. So Peniel means the face of God. He said, Yet my life has been spared. At sunrise, as he left Peniel, Jacob limped along because of his hip. So that holy encounter with the mystery of God will not leave him unmarked. He will limp the rest of his life. The wound of that struggle will remain with him. So, one theological reading of the text would be to say, Jacob, he's been a scoundrel. He's been deceptive. He has to face what he's done and wrestle with God to get his new identity, to be made holy, as it were, to be set apart by God. This is not an easy thing. He had to go through 20 years of his uncle's deceptiveness. Now he's got to get that interior wrestling finished before he can meet his brother. That is why to this day the Israelites do not eat the sciatic muscle that is on the hip socket, inasmuch as Jacob's hip socket was struck at the sciatic muscle. So getting a little etiology, an explanation of why God's people do what they do at this point. Oh yeah, that goes back to Jacob. Then Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming accompanied by 400 men. So that's when he divides up the family. Children among Leah, Rachel, and 2 maidservants, putting the maids and their children first, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing to the ground 7 times until he reached his brother. Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, and flinging himself on his neck, kissed him as he wept. Profound, isn't it? Esau is a man of reconciliation, cheated by his brother out of both birthright and blessing, and his mother. Esau chooses to welcome his brother home with reconciliation. It's a pre-shadowing of what Joseph will do with his brothers, but also what Christ does from a Christian angle of reconciling humanity to God. So not holding the sins of Jacob against him, he will embrace him as a brother. Profound. So, it's interesting. In the end, you have this beautiful reconciliation between brothers. Maybe that's the biblical way of saying, in the end, we do go through a lot of conflict, a lot of sibling rivalry in human history, but the goal of it all is reconciliation. A little less edifying, let's go on to chapter 34, right? So we have all these stories that are more edifying, less edifying. What happens here is the rape of Dinah, by the Canaanites. So Dinah, the daughter whom Leah had borne to Jacob, went out to visit some of the women of the land, and when Shechem the son of Hamor the Hivite, who was chief of the region, saw her, he seized her and lay with her by force. Since he was strongly attracted to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, indeed, he was really in love with the girl. He endeavored to win her affection after he raped her, of course. Shechem also asked his father Hamor, Get me this girl for a wife. Meanwhile, Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, but since his sons were out in the fields with his livestock, he held his peace until they came home. So Jacob wants to do something. He's going to wait till the boys get home. Now Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to discuss the matter with Jacob. just as Jacob's sons were coming in from the field. So when they heard the news, the men were shocked and seethed with indignation. So Jacob's sons, Dinah's brothers, are angry about this. What Shechem had done was an outrage in Israel. Such a thing could not be tolerated. Hamor appealed to them, saying, "My son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us." So there's a problem here. They took Dinah by rape, and also now they want to intermarry, which for Israel is a matter of defilement. You start intermarrying with the other peoples, you're going to defile yourself and worship the other gods, not the Lord God. So that's the question of purity is now at stake. "And take our daughters for yourselves. Thus you can live among us. The land is open before you. You can settle and move about in it freely and acquire landed property here." Then Shechem too appealed to Dinah's father and brothers, "Do me this favor, and I will pay you whatever you demand of me." So what will Jacob demand? Well, he's going to say, you guys are not circumcised like we are. Once Abraham made this covenant with God, all the men were circumcised. So if you all want to intermarry with us, if you want to have Dinah for your wife, all of the men are going to have to be circumcised. So they say, okay, and they all get circumcised. So, when you're circumcised, you're in a considerable amount of pain, unable to protect yourself. And two of the brothers decide this is the time to get rid of them, and they slaughter all the men. So it's a open slaughter takes place. Verse 25, "On the third day, while they were still in pain, Dinah's full brothers, Simeon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, took their swords, advanced against the city without any trouble, and massacred all the males. After they put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword, they took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. Then the other sons of Jacob followed up in the slaughter and sacked the city in reprisal for their sister Dinah's defilement. They seized their flocks, herds, and asses, whatever was in the city and the country all around. They carried off all their wealth, their women, and their children, and took for loot whatever was in the houses." So they certainly repaid for what happened to their sister Dinah. Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, that wasn't Jacob's plan apparently, "You have brought trouble upon me by making me loathsome to the inhabitants of the land of the Canaanites and the Perizzites. I have so few men that if these people unite against me and attack me, I and my family will be wiped out." But they retorted, "Should our sister have been treated like a harlot?" So it's interesting. I call that chapter another text of terror. So if we go down a little bit further, we're going to then get the descendants of Jacob, and we'll also hear about the descendants of Esau. Chapter 35, verse 9, God appeared to Jacob again, blessed him, and said, "You whose name is Jacob shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." Another naming narrative. Then he named him Israel. God also said to him, "I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply." This is priestly language. "Stem from you, kings shall issue from your loins. The land that I once gave to Abraham and Isaac, I now give to you, and to your descendants after you will I give this land." So land, descendants, the promise made to Abraham, renewed for Jacob, who is now Israel. So we'll hear about Jacob's family as you go down the list. And in chapter 36, we'll get all of the descendants of Esau. They don't get this blessing in the same way. So they're not going to be the direct recipients of this covenant, as it were, that the Lord God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now Israel, not Esau. And then in chapter 37, which we'll start next week, we'll go into the story of Joseph. So Fascinating stories of ancestors, huh? And again, why would God choose someone like Jacob? That, I think, is precisely the theological point. You know, it underlines the fact that what Paul says in his letter, while we were still sinners, God chose us. It wasn't because we were good that Christ came and died for us. It was precisely because we were sinners that God acted mercifully. So it's to underline the fact that the choice of God, God's promise and blessing, are in a sense, a gift of God's faithfulness to humanity, not our goodness that earned it. Okay, questions, observations tonight?
It seems in the beginning, there is so much deception
Yes.
between people that the lying and the, passing something off on something else. And I have a problem with that, and then nothing goes right unless God steps in. There seems to be no outside recourse, no tribal code, nothing else that comes, that the people can count on within themselves. And I don't know if they count on God either. I know God intervenes.
Yeah, so the question seems to be about these human beings, they're full of deceptiveness, and there seems to be no interior way of correcting the evils that are afflicting human beings. It takes God's intervention over and over again.
But they don't ask for God's intervention.
And they don't ask for God's intervention, but God does intervene. And as I pointed out, Jacob is deceptive, but the consequences of what he did to his brother had to be lived out for 20 years. And then he had to wrestle with God and was permanently affected by that wrestling in the night in order for that narrative of God's promise to go forward. So there are still consequences for this destructive behavior. And so, terrible things happen all through the text. And there are consequences most often for that behavior. But it's also showing God is still working through all that messiness. I suppose on another note, we could say that maybe that should make us rethink, if you look at the story of, for example, American history, we have this sort of Christian mythos that we're God's new people. We came to the land of promise. God gave us this whole new country. But when you look underneath that, look what we did to the native peoples who lived here before we got here, Europeans, if you're a descendant of Europeans. And look what we did in enslaving people from Africa. And so there's a destructive darkness about our own history that people don't like to look at, honestly, as Americans. And so maybe we should be a bit more humble about being judgmental of Israel's failures, right? When we ourselves are not always a shining example of virtue and goodness ourselves, right? And we could also personalize that, couldn't we, right? Because if we're all truthful and honest, most of us have not been saintly throughout our lives and done everything honestly and justly and uprightly and kindly and virtuously at all moments of our life. So, we should remember that God chose us despite the fact that we too are weak and sinful and make all kinds of bad choices in our own personal lives at times, right? So it's, in a sense, the constant biblical narrative is a reminder that God's goodness to us is not a result of our human virtue, but quite the contrary. Once we experience the goodness of God, we want to be virtuous like God. We want to become God-like.
The difference between us and them is that we have the law.
We have the law.
And we know when we do something devious,
We have the law today, and yes, and the law has not yet been given. General commands that are given We'll get the law in Exodus. We're coming up to that soon. But it's interesting because even when they get the law, sin still continues. As Paul puts it in his letter to the Romans, we'll see that next spring in the letter to the Galatians, the law was powerless to make human beings good. It convicted us of the wrong we were doing. But yes, but the intentionality of God in giving the law is to show us the path, to give us the boundaries. Yeah, that's a whole, yes, so the land, descendants are God's great gifts. The other great gift of God for the people of Israel, was God's law, the Torah. That's the great gift of God to them, to guide the people, to give them light on the path.
Did they have natural law?
Well, we as Catholics, of course, we have this theology of natural law, right? That in every human is inscribed the difference between good and evil. The law has been inscribed. We know the difference between right and wrong. We've all been given a conscience. And so that's why God can confront, even in the beginning of Genesis, Adam and Eve and Cain for their misdeeds, even though no law has been given. There's something that they've done that is wrong, and they know it already. They're covering themselves up. And so there is an intuitive natural law, we would say. That's our Catholic way of describing it looking back. That even without a written law, there is in the human DNA a conscience and awareness of the difference between right and wrong, good and evil. Other questions or observations? It's quite a lot in Genesis that we don't think about, isn't there? Some of these stories are so long they don't get into our lectionary in a whole form. So we never sit down with the whole story and go, oh wow, we never see the whole narrative unfold.
I had several reactions when I was reading all these horrible things that people did. I thought, thank heavens, that God gave Moses the Ten Commandments, and you're right, it doesn't end. And another observation, the story of Jacob's deception that you read word for word. I mean, it was a great story. It would make a great movie,
Yes.
And yet, there are so many detailed narratives in the Old Testament. But then when you get to the New Testament, I mean, everything is centered around Jesus, and he uses parables that are so difficult to understand, except at a deep level, but there's much more to it. And so you would think that since the New Testament writers were closer in time historically, that the narratives could be fleshed out more, but they're not. How could these Old Testament stories that are so old be so detailed and rich?
Okay, so the question is, I was reminded I need to repeat questions in summary form for the people who are watching later or online. So the question is, these stories sometimes have a great depth of narrative detail, like the story of the deception of Jacob and Rebekah. And why don't we get that same detail in, for example, the Gospels, which are much closer between events and the written time? I think part of it is that those who are telling the stories of Israel, remember, would have told these narratives around the campfire. Let's tell the kids would have said, tell the story about Jacob and Esau again. And so the storytelling would have been part of an oral culture. And so the detail of the stories would have been handed on. And then when put into writing, of course, shaped by the hand of the writer as well. So you have narrative masterpieces that are lengthy like this. With Jesus and the Gospels, the only lengthy narrative that you sort of really get is the passion and death of Jesus. Otherwise, they're very brief stories for the most part, except John's Gospel is more of a different form.
Nothing about Mary.
Little about his mother Mary in the Gospels, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So some significant moments, but yeah, these are fascinating stories because they really do They reveal the humanity very clearly, and they also have these bright moments of God's intervention. But you also get the feeling that with Abraham, for example, that God and Abraham had lots of close connected moments together, many narratives about God and Abraham encountering. And you get the sense that by the time Jacob comes along, that it's a little further along, farther and fewer between, and some vivid dreams in the night, but not as, you don't get the sense that Jacob and God have the same closeness and intimacy that Abraham and God did. That's sort of my read of the text. Moses, yes, we'll get to Moses later. All right, so a reminder of schedule, by the way, next week we will indeed finish the whole book of Genesis. So if you haven't finished reading it, I encourage you to read all the way through to the end of the book of Genesis by next week for sure. The week after that is Halloween, so we won't meet that evening, but starting on November the 7th, we'll go into the book of, or we moved that date, I think, didn't we? Because I have retreat that week. So we'll be meeting with 2 weeks off, then we'll be back on the 14th of November. That's when we're going to start looking at Exodus. So my encouragement would be, by the time the 14th of November comes, try to read the whole book of Exodus. So read through it, get a first read of it. We'll have 2 different nights on the book of Exodus, and then we're going to be looking at Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So a lot of reading material. Yeah.
November 2nd on the syllabus, it says All Hallows Eve. Is that a break?
Yeah, that's a break. All Hallowed Eve, yes. Halloween, yep. We won't be meeting on Halloween. Unless you all want to come and be in costume, so. We're actually, Father Joe and Father Mike and we're taking Father Mike to supper for his birthday that evening. That's not his actual birthday, but we're going to take him on Halloween to have dinner, so God willing, so. All right, we all have a great week. Shall we just close with maybe the prayer that Jesus taught us, as we're mindful of really a longing for the need for the coming of God's kingdom in our world. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Go in peace.